The clinking of crystal and the hushed murmur of Beverly Hills elite provided the deceptively tranquil soundtrack to Victoria Sterling's meticulously curated world. At 42, with a silhouette as sharp and unyielding as the trajectory of her career, she exuded the brittle confidence of a self-made titan. Tonight, the air itself seemed charged with the anticipation of her triumph. A colossal $200 million merger agreement lay poised to seal the biggest deal of Sterling Dynamics history. The pressure of months, even years, of relentless negotiation had tautened her nerves to a painful pitch, leaving no room for error, and certainly no tolerance for insolence. It was into this rarefied, high-stakes atmosphere that David Washington, a 25-year-old black waiter, intruded. His movements were practiced, almost invisible, as he navigated the labyrinth of linen-draped tables. He was a phantom, serving, observing, existing on the periphery of their privileged perception. Yet, as he meticulously poured wine, a flicker of something caught his eye on the document Victoria was reviewing. A phrase, an anomaly, that snagged at a mind far sharper than his uniform suggested. A quiet, almost involuntary comment escaped his lips, a gentle suggestion of a correction to the labyrinthine legal text. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and chillingly theatrical. Victoria Sterling, her face already flushed with the intoxicating blend of success and exhaustion, slammed her fist on the polished restaurant table. The delicate china rattled, a jarring discord in the symphony of affluence, and the room's elegant hum died instantly. Every eye, drawn by the sudden, violent outburst, fixated on the scene. The $200 million merger agreement, a document representing years of her life's work, flew through the air, its crisp pages fluttering in a grotesque parody of surrender before landing ignominiously at David's feet. "If you're so smart, then translate," she spat, her voice, usually a tool of calculated persuasion, now a raw, cutting blade, laced with contempt so thick it was almost palpable. As David bent to gather the scattered pages from the cold marble floor, his hands moved with an unnerving, almost disturbing calm. There was no tremor, no hint of the panic or subservience Victoria so clearly expected. His eyes, when they met hers, held a disturbing serenity, as if he had already weathered storms far more treacherous than a billionaire CEO's ego crisis. Victoria, unaccustomed to being questioned by anyone, let alone a black waiter on the night shift, felt a flicker of irritation mingle with her righteous fury. "Intruder," she scoffed, a dismissive laugh echoing through the hushed dining room. "You were literally reading over my shoulder while serving dinner. What kind of establishment is this?" James Peterson, the restaurant manager, appeared instantly, his face slick with apologetic sweat, ready to banish David to the kitchen, to re-establish the fragile order of class and control. But David didn't move. He stood, quietly organizing the scattered pages before returning them to Victoria, his posture radiating an intriguing, almost insolent preparedness. "Actually," he said, his voice soft but unwavering, a stark counterpoint to her rage, "I noticed an inconsistency in the third paragraph of the termination clause. The language allows for double interpretations that could nullify the entire agreement in the event of a dispute." The silence that followed was deafening, thicker than before, broken only by the frantic beat of Victoria's own heart. A hot flush crept up her neck. Her Harvard lawyers, her elite team, had scrutinized that contract dozens of times, yet a cold seed of doubt, planted by a mere waiter, began to sprout in her mind. Her voice, laced with venomous sarcasm, barely concealed her rising unease. "Do you have any legal training? Let me guess, you watched a few episodes of a TV show about lawyers." For the first time, a subtle smile touched David's lips, a knowing, almost unsettling curve that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Something like that," he murmured. Victoria snatched the contract, waving it like a weapon. "Very well, waiter professor, if you're so smart, then prove it. Translate every paragraph into language even a child can understand. And I want it done here, now, in front of everyone." The challenge hung in the air, potent and volatile, drawing discreet glances and furtive cell phone recordings from other diners. David's gaze swept over the room, then landed on the contract, and finally, on Victoria, with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Because once I start, I won't stop until I'm done. And you might not like what you find." Victoria's predatory smile widened. I'm counting on it. Let's see what you're made of. What no one in that elegant hall, least of all Victoria, could have possibly imagined was the calculated, almost chilling depth of David's true agenda. His seemingly simple suggestion had not been a random act of helpfulness, but the deliberate opening gambit of a long-conceived strategy. For years, he had quietly observed the corrosive patterns of prejudice, how individuals like Victoria wielded their power to exploit and dismiss others based solely on superficial judgments. His own family's history, punctuated by financial ruin and emotional distress born from predatory landlords, abusive banks, and exploitative employers, had taught him a harsh, undeniable truth: legal knowledge was the ultimate shield. He worked as a waiter not out of necessity, but as a meticulously chosen cover, a strategic position that granted him unparalleled access to the lives and vulnerabilities of people exactly like Victoria. He had been waiting, patiently, for the perfect moment to not just expose, but to fundamentally alter the landscape of their ingrained prejudice. He was not a victim of this public humiliation. He was its quiet architect, transforming the stage of her arrogance into the theatre of her impending downfall. The unveiling of a masterful legal mind. The silence that followed Victoria's arrogant challenge was not one of submission, but of profound anticipation. David, his face a study in composure, met her contemptuous gaze with an unwavering calm that only heightened her unease. He had given her an out, a chance to retreat from the precipice, but her pride, her ingrained prejudice, had pushed her to double down. "Are you sure?" His voice, a quiet counterpoint to the roaring impatience in her mind, had echoed, carrying an unsettling weight. Now, as he began to read the contract aloud, his clear diction resonated through the hushed hall, each word dropping like a carefully placed stone. "Clause 1, he articulated, his eyes, unnervingly, fixed on hers rather than the page. Transfer of assets in the amount of $217 million upon regulatory approval. He paused, letting the high stakes linger in the air. "In plain English," he continued, a subtle shift in his tone, "your company is buying another company for $217 million, but only if the government allows it." Victoria felt a cold knot tightening in her stomach, a prickle of discomfort she quickly tried to suppress with a scornful smile. "Anyone can read the first line," she scoffed, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "Continue, waiter." "Clause 2, David continued, unperturbed. 90-day audit period with unrestricted access to accounting records and intellectual property." Another pause, a deliberate beat of suspense. Translation: "You have 3 months to dig up all the secrets of the company you're buying, but watch out for what comes next." A low murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Forks clinked, then fell silent as people leaned forward, their curiosity now fully engaged. Cold sweat pricked Victoria's palms, but her expression remained rigidly hard, a marble mask of defiance. "Now we get to the interesting part," David murmured, turning to the third page with the unnerving precision of someone who knew the document intimately, not just reading it for the first time. "Termination clause for adverse material change. Here's the first problem, Ms. Sterling." He pointed to a dense paragraph, his finger a precise accusation. "This text allows the other company to cancel the sale if there is any event that materially alters market conditions. The problem is that it doesn't define what significant constitutes. It could be 5%, it could be 50%. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. Her elite Harvard lawyers, whom she had paid $400,000 to review this very contract, had missed this devastating ambiguity. The sheer audacity of this waiter, identifying such a critical flaw in minutes, sent a shiver of fear down her spine. "Wait, it gets better," David continued, clearly warming to his task, the subtle energy of revelation now flowing through him. "The clause allows them to keep the $20 million down payment as compensation for administrative costs, even if they cancel. In plain language, they can legally steal $20 million from you." "Enough." Victoria exploded, slamming her hand on the table again, the remnants of her composure finally shattering. "I'm not going to let some miserable restaurant waiter lecture me about contracts reviewed by Chicago's top law firms." "Actually," David replied with a disturbing calm that sliced through her outburst, "they were reviewed by the worst. because any minimally competent lawyer would have spotted these traps in 15 minutes. The manager, James, approached nervously, sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "David, maybe you should stop here." "No," Victoria shrieked, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Let this clown continue. I want to see how far this charade goes." But inside, Victoria Sterling was spiraling into a cold panic. How had a mere waiter, in barely 20 minutes, detected what a team of elite, college-educated lawyers, paid exorbitant fees, had missed in 3 months of review? Even more terrifying, if he was right about these glaring flaws, how many other deadly problems lurked within the hundreds of pages of that contract? David, with an almost scientific detachment, observed the subtle changes in her breathing, the rapid rise and fall of her chest, and allowed himself a small, internal smile. He had spent the last 7 years studying contracts exactly like this one, not as an academic hobby, but as a matter of family survival. When you grow up watching your mother being systematically cheated by predatory landlords, abusive banks, and exploitative employers, you learn very quickly that legal knowledge isn't just power. It's the fundamental difference between getting trampled and fiercely protecting yourself. "Do you want me to continue with the intellectual property clause?" David asked, flipping through a few more pages, his voice still calm, yet now carrying an undeniable edge of challenge. "Because this one is even more toxic. They retain rights to any innovation developed jointly, even after a separation." Victoria, her face now a kaleidoscope of red and white, snatched the contract from his hands, violently. "It's over. I won't tolerate another second of this humiliation. James, call security and get this man out of here immediately." David stood up slowly, but showed no sign of intimidation. "Of course, Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice almost conversational. "But before I leave, wouldn't you like to know about Clause 17? The one that basically hands over control of your company to them in the event of any future dispute." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Victoria froze, the contract still clutched in her hands, her face alternating between a furious crimson and a deathly white. Every person in the restaurant could feel the tension, sharp and cutting like a knife. There, before all eyes, now filled with genuine curiosity instead of contempt, David stood firm, utterly composed, like someone who had just revealed only the barest tip of a much larger, more dangerous iceberg. What no one in that elegant hall, especially Victoria, could have imagined was that this young man carried not only an astonishing depth of legal knowledge, but also secrets about Victoria Sterling herself that would transform this public humiliation into something far more perilous for her than any poorly drafted contract. The air in the Meridian restaurant crackled with a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Victoria Sterling stood frozen, the damning contract still clutched in her hand, her face a chaotic canvas of fury and fear. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, fixated on David, who remained utterly composed amidst the chaos he had so deliberately orchestrated. Just as her mind reeled, trying desperately to find an escape from the corner he had meticulously pushed her into, a familiar voice cut through the strained silence from the back of the dining room. In fact, the voice resonated, calm and authoritative. "He's absolutely right." Every head in the room swiveled. An elegant man in his 60s, exuding an aura of quiet power, walked calmly towards their table. It was Robert Mitchell, a name that sent a jolt of pure dread through Victoria. The legendary corporate lawyer, senior partner at Mitchell & Associates, was a titan in the legal world, renowned for pulling companies back from the brink of disastrous mergers and predatory contracts. He had famously saved IBM from a hostile takeover in the 90s. He was, quite simply, one of the best. James, the restaurant manager, stammered out a greeting, flustered by the unexpected presence of such a luminary. Robert merely offered a gentle smile. "I was at the corner table, trying to enjoy a quiet meal," he explained, his gaze settling on David with an almost paternal warmth, "until I overheard this fascinating discussion." He looked directly at David. "Young man," Robert's voice was laced with genuine curiosity, "where exactly did you learn to dissect contracts like that?" The question hung in the air, charged with unspoken implications. David took a deep breath, the subtle shift in his posture signaling that the moment of truth, the culmination of his carefully constructed ruse, had finally arrived. Mr. Mitchell, David began, his voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the now silent room, I believe we've met. David Washington, Harvard Law School, specializing in corporate law. I worked as an intern at your firm for 2 summers. Victoria's jaw literally dropped. The contract slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the table with a soft thud. Harvard. An intern for Robert Mitchell? Her mind raced, desperately trying to reconcile the image of the unassuming waiter with the revelation of a brilliant legal mind. Robert Mitchell nodded slowly, a proud smile forming on his face. Of course. David Washington. One of the brightest interns to ever walk through my office. I remember your work on the TechCorp merger in 2022 perfectly. Intern. Victoria stammered, her voice thin, struggling to process the information, the layers of her reality peeling back with brutal speed. Not just an intern, Robert corrected, his gaze now sweeping over the stunned faces in the room. David here saved my client from a contract that would have cost them $80 million in hidden predatory clauses. He identified 7 issues that our senior staff had missed. David's eyes, now filled with a quiet, steely intensity, met Victoria's directly. Ms. Sterling, he stated, his voice devoid of anger, yet heavy with undeniable truth, I don't work as a waiter because I have no other options. I work here because it's my girlfriend's family's restaurant, and I'm helping them out during a difficult time. But my specialty is identifying pitfalls in merger contracts. The floor beneath Victoria's feet seemed to disappear. The man she had so casually humiliated, the miserable restaurant waiter, was in fact a highly qualified legal professional, a graduate with the highest honors from Harvard Law. Robert confirmed this, adding another layer of shock. And if memory serves me correctly, David, you only failed the bar exam by a few points due to a family problem at the time of the exam, correct? My mother had a stroke the week of the exam, David explained calmly, his voice revealing a deeper layer of his character, unwavering dedication to family. I chose to take care of her instead of taking the exam. I'll try again next term. The entire restaurant was now completely silent, all customers watching the scene unfold, riveted by the dramatic revelation. Victoria Sterling, the ruthless CEO who had publicly humiliated a mere waiter, had just discovered, under the watchful gaze of one of the country's greatest legal legends, that she had attacked a Harvard-educated lawyer. The irony was a bitter, unbearable taste in her mouth. David, Robert said thoughtfully, his gaze turning serious, if I'm not mistaken, you also have specific experience with the type of contract Ms. Sterling is about to sign, don't you? Something related to Sterling Dynamics. David nodded slowly, and for the first time since the discussion began, he allowed a genuine smile to cross his face, a smile that was not cruel, but carried the weight of impending reckoning. Actually, Mr. Mitchell, David began, his voice holding an almost theatrical calm, I've spent the last 6 months analyzing every public operation of Sterling Dynamics. It's fascinating how some companies repeat the same patterns of legal negligence. Victoria felt the air escape from her lungs. The implication was clear, chilling. Her entire empire was under scrutiny, and the man she had mocked held the keys to its potential undoing. What do you mean by that? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper, a stark contrast to her earlier booming arrogance. The air felt thin around her, her world rapidly shrinking. I mean, David continued, his voice calm, cutting through her mounting terror, that I've identified 16 serious problems so far in this particular contract. Ms. Sterling is about to lose not only the $200 million but also effective control of her own company. He paused dramatically, letting the full weight of his words sink in, watching the color drain from Victoria's face. But there's something even more interesting that I discovered during my research. Robert Mitchell, clearly intrigued by the unfolding drama, raised an eyebrow. Go on, he prompted, a subtle nod encouraging David. David, with a casualness that belied the monumental impact of his next revelation, discreetly took his phone out of his pocket. Well, it turns out that I've been recording this entire conversation since the moment you called me a miserable waiter. I've documented every insult, every display of prejudice, every attempt at public humiliation. Victoria's blood ran cold. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, confirming her worst fears. Several people were still recording with their cell phones. The situation had morphed from a private, contained humiliation into a full-blown public disaster, unfolding for an unseen audience. "You can't use that," she whispered, her voice stripped of all authority, a desperate plea. "Actually, I can," David replied calmly, his composure unwavering. "This is a public establishment. There is no expectation of privacy, and documenting racial discrimination in the workplace is not only legal but recommended." Robert Mitchell watched, a flicker of professional awe in his eyes. "David," he said, his voice thoughtful, "may I ask what exactly his plan is? Because something tells me you're not improvising." David looked around the restaurant, allowing his gaze to settle on Victoria with an intensity that made her instinctively recoil. "My plan, Mr. Mitchell, is very simple. First, I'm going to save Sterling Dynamics from a contract that would destroy the company. Second, I'm going to document how racial prejudice nearly cost a CEO $200 million because she refused to listen to valuable advice based solely on the color of the person offering it." Victoria looked around desperately, searching for an exit, a way to regain some semblance of dignity. But she was surrounded by dozens of eyes that no longer held contempt for David, but rather a mixture of admiration and intense curiosity at how this impossible turnaround had happened. "And third," David continued, his voice still calm, but now laden with a steely determination that made Victoria realize she was dealing with something far, far bigger than she had ever imagined. "I will make sure this story serves as an example to anyone who thinks they can humiliate others based on appearances or prejudice." There, in front of everyone who had witnessed her arrogance and prejudice, Victoria Sterling began to truly comprehend the magnitude of her blunder. She had underestimated not just a waiter, but an intellectual adversary who now held in his hands not only the knowledge to dismantle her biggest business deal, but also the tools and the deep personal motivation to turn her humiliation into a devastating public lesson. What she couldn't yet imagine was that David had planned every single second of that encounter, and that the real twist, the final, crushing blow, was yet to come. "Wait," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling for the first time since she had arrived at the restaurant, the facade finally crumbling. "You said you researched my operations for 6 months. How did you know I'd be here today?" David exchanged a meaningful glance with Robert Mitchell, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Sterling," David said, his voice dangerously calm, "do you really believe this meeting was a coincidence? I've been working at this restaurant for exactly 3 weeks, ever since I discovered that you dine here every Tuesday at 8 p.m., always alone, always reviewing important contracts." Victoria's blood froze completely. You followed me." "I did my homework," David corrected calmly, a subtle difference in his tone. "There's a substantial difference. You see, when Robert Mitchell told me about a CEO who was about to sign the worst contract in modern corporate history, I thought it would be interesting to intervene." Robert smiled with paternal pride. "David, tell her about the consulting." "Consulting?" Victoria repeated, her voice now barely a thread of sound. "For the past 6 months, I've been working as a freelance legal consultant for Hartwell Enterprises, the company that's trying to buy Sterling Dynamics." David paused, allowing the information to sink in, watching the dawning horror in her eyes. "They hired me specifically to identify all of your company's legal vulnerabilities before finalizing the acquisition." Victoria felt as if the floor had literally disappeared beneath her feet. That's a conflict of interest," she stammered, clinging to any thread of legal defense. "Actually, it's not," Robert interjected professionally. "David never signed any confidentiality agreement with your company, and you just publicly humiliated him based purely on racial prejudice. He has every legal right to use knowledge gained through public research to protect you from your own incompetence." David took out his phone and began typing rapidly. "Speaking of protection," he said, "I just sent an email to the Sterling Dynamics board with a complete analysis of the problems with the contract. 16 critical points that your lawyers missed, including a clause that effectively hands control of your company over to Hartwell in 18 months. You can't do that." Victoria screamed, lunging toward his phone. "I already did," David replied calmly, showing her the screen. "Email sent at 9:15 p.m. to all board members, with copies to the SEC and 3 journalists specializing in corporate mergers whom I know personally." Victoria looked around desperately. The entire restaurant was now riveted, and at least 10 people were recording. You don't understand. This merger represents 2 years of work. If it doesn't go through, Sterling Dynamics could go bankrupt. Sterling Dynamics will go bankrupt if the merger goes through under the current terms, David replied firmly. But now it won't, because the board has enough information to renegotiate or cancel it completely. Robert Mitchell watched with professional fascination. David, show her the most interesting part. David smiled, a genuine smile that was neither cruel nor triumphant, but rather the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planned every single move perfectly. Miss Sterling, do you remember firing a junior lawyer 3 months ago, Kevin Thompson? You claimed he was incompetent and unsuitable for the corporate environment. Victoria paled even more. What does that have to do with anything? Kevin is my cousin, David revealed, the connection slamming into Victoria with unexpected force. And he sent me copies of all the emails you sent to Human Resources describing why he should be fired. Emails full of coded racist language and comments about how people from certain backgrounds don't fit into the company culture. That's a lie. Victoria protested, but her voice carried no conviction. David showed the screen of his phone again. I have 47 emails from you over the course of 6 months, all documenting a clear pattern of racial discrimination disguised as cultural inadequacy. And now, I have tonight's recording, where you demonstrate the exact same behavior in public. Victoria tried one last desperate card. I'm going to sue you for defamation. For invasion of privacy. For why? Robert Mitchell interrupted gently. For saving your company from a disastrous contract. For documenting racial discrimination. For exposing legal incompetence that would have cost shareholders $200 million. He paused dramatically. Miss Sterling, if I were you, I'd be thanking me, not threatening me. David calmly put away his phone. My work here is done. The Sterling Dynamics board now has all the information it needs to make intelligent decisions. Journalists have a fascinating story about how racial prejudice nearly cost a company $200 million, and you, Ms. Sterling, have a valuable lesson about treating people with respect, regardless of their apparent position. Victoria sat down heavily in her chair, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of what had happened. In a single night, she had lost not only the biggest deal of her career but also her reputation, her authority over the board, and quite possibly, her job once this story became public. Why? She whispered, her voice broken. Why do this? David looked at her with a serenity that cut deeper than any anger. Because people like you believe they can humiliate others based solely on appearances. Because someone needs to demonstrate that knowledge and competence have no color. And because the best way to fight prejudice is not with anger, but with excellence. There, in the middle of that elegant restaurant, where it had all begun with contempt and humiliation, a lesson was being written in real time about the devastating consequences of underestimating people based on prejudice. What no one could have imagined was that that night would be just the beginning of much bigger changes in both their lives, and that the real transformation was yet to come. 3 weeks later, the once impenetrable fortress of Victoria Sterling's executive office on the 30th floor of Sterling Dynamics was a scene of quiet dismantling. Through the panoramic window, she watched emotionlessly as security guards methodically packed her personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The Sterling Dynamics board, swayed by the devastating analysis David had provided, an analysis that laid bare not just the current contractual pitfalls but a systematic pattern of legal negligence costing the company millions in previous settlements, had voted unanimously for her removal as CEO. The story, fueled by the viral video of David's public humiliation and the subsequent revelation of his true credentials, had exploded across social media. Headlines screamed, "Racist CEO destroyed by Harvard-educated waiter, and the moment prejudice cost $200 million." The comments were a relentless torrent of condemnation, and swiftly, several companies cancelled contracts with Sterling Dynamics, citing incompatible values. Victoria Sterling was, definitively, a pariah. David, however, was soaring. In just 2 weeks, he'd received 47 job offers, including proposals from 3 of the country's largest law firms and a coveted position as senior legal counsel at Hartwell Enterprises itself. Robert Mitchell, a man whose word carried immense weight, had personally recommended David for a junior partner position at his prestigious firm, bypassing years of traditional experience. But the offer that truly resonated came from an unexpected source. A group of visionary investors had offered him full funding to launch his own law firm. Thus, David Washington Law Office for Business Justice was born, specializing in protecting small businesses from predatory contracts. It already boasted a waiting list of 300 potential clients, mostly small business owners who, having seen the viral video, recognized a champion who truly understood their struggles. The threads of justice continued to weave. Kevin Thompson, David's cousin, who had been wrongfully fired, received an $800,000 out-of-court settlement when Victoria's discriminatory emails became undeniable evidence in a racial discrimination lawsuit. He used the money to finish law school, becoming the first official employee of David's thriving new firm. The ill-fated merger between Sterling Dynamics and Hartwell Enterprises never materialized. David's analysis, once validated by independent auditors, prompted Hartwell to withdraw its offer completely, citing unacceptable governance risks. Sterling Dynamics, under new leadership, managed to survive, but Victoria lost a staggering 90% of her shares in settlements with furious investors who threatened lawsuits for fiduciary negligence. Robert Mitchell, now David's official mentor, frequently recounted the story of the Meridian restaurant in his lectures on corporate ethics. In 30 years of law, he'd often declare, "I've never seen anyone identify so many contractual problems in such a short time. And I've never seen anyone lose so much money by simply failing to see beyond the color of someone's skin." James Peterson, the restaurant manager, profoundly impacted by the events, promoted David to unofficial legal advisor, discovering that 3 of the restaurant's supplier contracts contained abusive clauses similar to those David had identified. The restaurant saved $200,000 in the first year alone by following David's recommendations. Victoria attempted to rebuild her career, but her history clung to her like a shadow. Executive headhunting firms stopped returning her calls, and when she finally landed a position at a smaller company, she found herself constantly monitored by diversity consultants, hired specifically to prevent similar incidents. 6 months after that transformative night, David returned to Meridian. This time, he wore an impeccable suit and was accompanied by 5 clients who had flown in from other states specifically to meet the lawyer who had become a legend on social media. James greeted him with a genuine smile and led them to the very same table where it had all begun. "Funny how life works," David mused to Robert Mitchell, who had joined them for dinner. "If she had simply treated me with basic respect that night, I would have pointed out the problems with the contract discreetly. She would have thanked me, and her company would be worth $200 million more today." Robert laughed, raising his glass of wine. "Arrogance always comes at a price, David. But in this case, the price was an education for a lot of people." David looked around the restaurant, taking in the same elegant tables and sophisticated decor, but now seeing everything through the eyes of someone who had turned a moment of profound humiliation into the foundation of an extraordinary career. He had learned that true victory wasn't in destroying Victoria Sterling, but in building something far greater than she could ever imagine. The best revenge, David discovered, wasn't to repay the damage done to you, but to achieve such brilliant success that the opinions of those who doubted you become utterly irrelevant. Sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest gift anyone can receive, because it removes all expectations and allows you to surprise the whole world.